The mountains had always been full of life and sound. The Crimson Peaks, with their tall red rocks and deep caves, were home to dragons who had lived there for many years. Every day the sound of young dragons playing would echo through the valleys. Their small wings would beat against the cold air as they learned to fly. Their happy cries would mix with the voices of adult dragons, teaching them to hunt and survive in the harsh mountain world. The peaks were a place of warmth and joy, even in the middle of the cold, icy seasons. But now, everything had changed. The silence was so complete and so heavy that it felt like a weight pressing down on every living thing in those mountains. It was not the peaceful silence of sleep or rest. It was the silence of loss, the silence of a world that had been broken by something terrible. Teo stood at the very edge of the highest cliff, looking out over the frozen world below him. He was the leader of the Dragon Pack, the one who made decisions and protected all those who lived in the caves of the Crimson Peaks. His body was massive, as tall as 5 grown men standing on top of each other. His wings were strong enough to carry him through the worst storms, but as he stood there in the cold morning light, even this mighty dragon looked small and broken. The scales that covered his body had once been beautiful. They had shined like gold mixed with fire, bright and full of life. But now they looked dark and dull, like old metal that had been left alone for a very long time. The color had faded from a brilliant gold to a bruised, ugly amber that matched the sadness in his eyes. Even his breathing seemed heavy, as though each breath took all the strength he had left. Behind him, 3 other dragons lay on the frozen ground. Misun, a strong female dragon with sharp eyes, had her body curled into a tight ball. Daijung, one of the oldest dragons in the pack, lay with his head resting on his paws, his eyes open, but not really seeing anything. Heiwon, the youngest of the adult dragons, simply stared at the sky without moving. All 3 of them showed the same signs of deep pain. Their breathing was slow and shallow. Their eyes were empty of hope. It was as though the light inside them had been blown out like candles in the wind. 2 weeks had passed since the terrible day when everything changed. 2 weeks since the sickness came to their home. It had started slowly. The first sign was when one of the small hatchlings, a young dragon named Tai Sung, had stopped eating. His mother, Mi Kyung, had noticed that he did not want to play with the other young dragons like he usually did. Instead, he wanted only to sleep in the warm caves where the fire kept the cold away. Within 2 days, other hatchlings started to show the same signs. They stopped playing. They stopped flying practice. They stopped eating the fresh meat that the hunters brought back. Then the fever came. The young dragons' bodies became hot to touch, so hot that steam would rise from their scales when the cool air of the caves reached them. Their cries became weak and confused. They no longer knew their own mothers. They called out in fear, unable to understand what was happening to their small bodies. The adult dragons had tried everything they knew. They had used the old healing methods passed down through many generations. They had brought the hatchlings to the warmest parts of the caves. They had brought them water to drink and tried to make them eat. They had held them close, using their own body heat to comfort the young ones. But nothing worked. Nothing could stop the sickness. One by one, the hatchlings died. Teo had stood next to his own mate, Yunji, as she cared for the youngest hatchlings in the deepest caves. She was a brave and kind dragon, known throughout the pack for her gentle nature and her love for all the young ones. Even as the sickness began to touch her own body, making her hot and weak, she did not stop caring for the hatchlings. She moved from one small dragon to another, giving them water, keeping them warm, speaking soft words of comfort. In the end, the sickness had taken her too. Teo had found her lying next to the last hatchling she had been trying to save, both of them cold and still. She had died protecting them, trying until the very last moment to save a life that was already beyond saving. 18 hatchlings, 18 young dragons who would never grow up, 18 futures that would never happen, 18 voices that would never call out to greet the morning sun. An entire generation wiped away in just 2 weeks. That was what the sickness had taken from them. And now, in this terrible quiet, the pack had to face a question that no living thing should ever have to face. What was the purpose of surviving if there was nothing left to survive for? Teo's sharp claws dug deep into the frozen earth beneath his feet. The pain of the action was nothing compared to the pain in his heart. His shoulders shook as another wave of grief passed through him, powerful enough to bring him to his knees. He made no sound. He simply stood there, shaking, letting his body feel the weight of everything that had been lost. The wind howled across the peaks, carrying with it the bitter cold of the approaching winter season. The wind sounded almost like it was crying, almost like it was mourning along with the dragons. Snow began to fall, soft at first, then heavier. The white flakes covered the rocks and the ground, slowly covering everything in a blanket of cold. The pack had not hunted for many days. There were still animals in the mountains, still prey to be found in the valleys below. But why would they hunt? Who would they bring food for? The young ones who would have eaten it were gone. The females who were preparing to teach the next generation of hunters were gone. There was no hunger in their bellies that was greater than the emptiness in their hearts. Misun shifted slightly on the frozen ground, and her eyes finally focused on something. She looked at Teo, and for just a moment, something like understanding passed between them. The understanding of two creatures who had loved deeply and lost everything. The sun moved across the sky, but it brought no warmth to the crimson peaks. The dragons did not move. They did not speak. They simply remained where they were, waiting for a darkness that matched the darkness inside them. The mountains, which had once been alive with joy and hope, had become a place of silence and death. Night would come soon. The stars would come out cold and distant, looking down on the grieving creatures below. And still, nothing would change. Still, the silence would continue. Still, the dragons would wait, with no hope and no reason to believe that anything could ever be good again. The weather changed without warning. In the mountains, storms came suddenly, appearing from nowhere like an unwanted visitor. One moment, the sky was a simple gray color, soft and heavy with clouds. The next moment, the entire world turned white. The wind came down from the highest peaks with a power that could knock over trees and move rocks. Snow fell so thickly that a dragon could not see the ground beneath its own feet. The temperature dropped so low that water would freeze almost instantly. Everything became a wall of white, with no beginning and no end. This was not the gentle snow of autumn, the kind that fell soft and quiet and made the world look clean and new. This was the angry snow of deep winter, the kind that could kill anything foolish enough to be caught in it, the kind that could bury a creature where it stood. Teo and the other dragons heard the storm coming from far away. They could hear the sound of it rushing down the mountainside, destroying everything in its path. When the white wall hit the caves where they lived, they felt the cold even deep inside the stone. The wind tried to push its way into their home, bringing ice and snow with it. The dragons felt the temperature drop, and they understood without words that this was a storm they could not fly through or hunt in. They would have to wait inside their caves until it passed. The 4 dragons moved deeper into their cave home, away from the entrance where the storm raged. There were smaller caves inside, spaces where generations of dragons had made their homes. These inner caves were warmer, protected from the wind and the cold by layers of stone and rock. There was even a place where the dragons had made a fire years ago, a spot where hot rocks created warmth that the dragons could use on the coldest nights. The dragons curled up together on the stone floor, their large bodies providing heat for each other. Teo lay on one side, his massive wings folded against his body. Mi-sun pressed herself against him, her smaller form fitting into the space between his body and the cave wall. Dae-jung lay across from them, his old body grateful for the warmth. Hae-won, the youngest, found a spot near the fire, where the heat was strongest. They did not speak. They rarely spoke anymore. There seemed to be nothing worth saying. Words required energy, and energy was something the dragons no longer had. They simply lay there in the darkness, listening to the sound of the storm raging outside, waiting for it to pass as they had waited for so many things in the past 2 weeks. They waited with no hope and no real desire for anything to change. Hours passed. Maybe it was a day. Time had stopped meaning much to them. Then, Hae-won heard something different in the sound of the storm. It was a sound that did not belong to the wind or the snow or the natural world of the mountains. It was a sound that was somehow both small and desperate, calling out like a creature in terrible pain. "There," Hae-won said. Her voice cracked and weak from not being used for so long. She had to clear her throat before the words would come out clearly. "There. Do you hear it?" Teo lifted his large head and listened. The sound came again, pushed toward them on the wind. It was a voice, definitely a voice. It was calling out in words that sounded almost like the languages of humans, though it was too broken and frightened for any words to be clear. Something stirred in Teo's chest, something he had thought was dead and gone, destroyed by grief and loss. It was not hope exactly, but it was something close to it. It was the instinct to help another creature in danger, an instinct that his grief had not completely erased. Without speaking, Teo stood up. His movements were slow and stiff, but he moved toward the entrance of the cave. The other dragons watched him but did not follow. They did not question his choice, but they also did not join him. The entrance to the cave was like walking into pure white. The blizzard was so thick that Teo could see no more than a few dragon lengths in any direction. The cold bit at his face and his eyes, making it hard to see or breathe. The wind pushed against him, trying to knock him backward. But Teo had lived in these mountains for many years. He knew how to move through storms. He placed his claws carefully on the frozen ground and pushed forward. The sound came again, closer now. It was the cry of something small and human, something that did not belong in these mountains, something that was dying in this cold, white world. Through the snow, Teo finally saw the shape. It was a human, just as he had thought. The figure was moving in an unclear way, stumbling and falling, rising and stumbling again. It was obvious that the person was completely lost, with no idea where they were going or how to save themselves from the storm. The human fell to their knees. Teo had seen humans before in his long life. He had seen them in the lower valleys where they built their towns and cities. He had seen them hunt for food and build fires and fight with each other over things that did not matter. Humans were fragile creatures, easy to kill, quick to use violence against anything they did not understand. There was no good reason for a dragon to help a human. In fact, there were many reasons not to help them. Humans had weapons. Humans had hunted dragons in the old days, trying to kill them for their beautiful scales and their valuable bones. But as Teo watched the human collapse into the snow, he thought of Yunji. He thought of his mate, holding the smallest hatchlings close to her body, protecting them from the sickness that was killing them. He thought of her love for the young ones, a love so strong that it had lasted until the very moment of her death. A human was a creature that did not deserve death in this cold, just as his hatchlings had not deserved death from the sickness. A creature was a creature, and there was something in the deepest part of Teo's heart that still remembered what it meant to care for something other than his own pain. He walked forward, moving against the wind and the cold. He walked until he reached the human, who was now half buried in the snow. The human saw him and tried to crawl away, fear flashing across his face. But the human was too weak and too cold to move far. Teo did not attack. Instead, he simply stood over the human, his great body blocking the wind. He lowered his massive head, and with a movement that was as gentle as he could make it, he pushed the human toward the direction of his cave. The human did not understand what was happening, but survival instinct took over. The human struggled to stand and began to move in the direction that the dragon was pushing them. Together, the dragon and the human moved through the white storm, toward the cave, toward warmth, toward something that might be the beginning of hope. Jinho woke up slowly, his mind confused and unclear. At first, he did not know where he was or how he had gotten there. His body was warm, which was strange because his last memory was of being terribly cold. So cold that he thought he was going to die. His skin had felt like ice, and his fingers and toes had stopped hurting because they had become too cold to feel anything at all. But now, warmth surrounded him like a heavy blanket. He opened his eyes and saw a red rock above him. He was inside a cave, a large cave that was definitely not a place he had ever been before. The walls were smooth in some places and rough in others, clearly shaped by water and time over many years. There was a fire burning not far from where he lay, its light flickering against the stone walls and creating dancing shadows. Jinho sat up slowly, his body stiff and painful. That was when he saw them, the dragons. His first reaction was fear, pure, complete fear that made his heart race in his chest and his breath come in quick, shallow gasps. His hand moved instantly toward the knife at his belt, the knife that he carried for hunting and cutting wood and protecting himself if needed. Dragons were not animals to trust. Dragons were monsters from old stories, creatures that killed for fun and loved to eat human flesh. This was what he had been taught since he was a small child. Humans and dragons were enemies. This was a simple fact. But then he stopped. He looked at the dragons more carefully, and something in what he saw made him hesitate before pulling out his knife. The biggest dragon lay not far from him. This was clearly the leader of the pack, the most powerful one. The dragon was looking at him with eyes that were full of sadness and something else that Jinho could not quite name. It was not hunger. It was not anger. If Jinho had to describe what he saw in those eyes, he would have called it grief. The dragon's body was large and impressive, but it was also thin, as though the creature had not eaten properly in many days. The other three dragons watched him with curiosity rather than hunger. They did not move toward him. They did not bare their teeth or make any threatening sounds. They simply watched, waiting to see what the small human would do. Very slowly, Jinho put his hand away from his knife. He realized that if these dragons had wanted to kill him, they could have done so easily while he was sleeping and helpless. Instead, they had brought him to warmth and fire. They had saved his life. Over the next few days, as the blizzard continued to rage outside the cave, Jinho began to understand more about the situation he found himself in. The biggest dragon, who he learned was called Teo, allowed him to move around the cave. The human explored and found that the cave was quite large, with many rooms and passages. There were storage areas where the dragons kept dried meat and bones from previous hunts. There was a sleeping area with soft moss and old cloth that had been collected over time. But there was also something else. There were small spaces, small sleeping areas that were clearly made for creatures much smaller than the adult dragons. Jinho understood that these were the living spaces of young dragons, hatchlings who would have played and grown here. But the spaces were empty, completely empty, and the emptiness felt heavy with meaning. It was on the third day that Jinho noticed something. Teo was limping. The large dragon tried to hide it, But when he moved, he clearly favored his front left leg. The leg was swollen, and the scales around the joint were damaged and red. There was an infection, Jin-Ho could tell, the kind of injury that could become very serious if it was not treated properly. "You're hurt," Jin-Ho said, speaking out loud for the first time since he had woken up. The words came out without him planning them, a physician's instinct overriding his fear. To his great surprise, the large dragon lowered his great head in a gesture that looked very much like agreement. Jin-Ho gathered his courage. He was a physician, trained since childhood in the healing arts by his own father, who had also been a doctor. He had learned about medicines and plants and how to help creatures in pain. He had learned that pain was the same in all creatures, whether they walked on 2 legs or 4, whether they had fur or scales. Pain was pain, and helping someone in pain was always the right thing to do. He moved carefully toward Teo, speaking in a soft voice to show that he meant no harm. "Let me help you," he said. "I know about healing." From his medical pack, which had miraculously survived the journey through the storm, Jin-Ho found clean cloths and salves made from special plants. He found water that he heated carefully in a stone pot. Then, with movements that were gentle and careful, he began to clean the wound on the dragon's leg. Teo did not move away. He did not attack. He simply lay there, allowing the small human to touch his injury and work on healing it. The other 3 dragons watched in silence. As Jin-Ho worked, he heard Mi-sun finally speak. Her voice heavy with sadness so deep that it seemed to come from somewhere very far away. "Our young ones," she said slowly, her words careful as though speaking might break something inside her that was barely holding together. "All of them. They are gone. The sickness took them from us." Jin-Ho stopped his work and looked at the female dragon. For the first time, he truly understood what he was seeing. This was not just a pack of dragons. This was a family that had been broken by loss. These were creatures who had survived something terrible, and now they existed in a kind of empty numbness, going through the motions of living without any real reason to continue. He had experienced that kind of grief. He knew exactly what that felt like. "I had a family, too," Jin-Ho said softly, continuing his work on Tao's wound. "My mother, my father, my 2 younger brothers. They all died in the mines when I was young, digging for minerals and metals. One day they went into the earth, and they never came back up." The dragons listened to him speak. In that cave, with the blizzard raging outside and the fire flickering inside, a human and 4 dragons shared their pain with each other. And for the first time in 2 weeks, it felt like the weight they were carrying might become just a little bit lighter. Jin-Ho finished treating Teo's wound and moved to help the other dragons, checking their health, offering what comfort he could through his knowledge and his care. And as he worked, he realized that he had found a purpose in his grief, just as these creatures were beginning to find one too. The weeks passed slowly, one day blending into another. Jin-Ho did not leave the cave. The blizzard eventually stopped, and the snow outside became less dangerous, less threatening. There were days when the sun came out and the weather was clear enough that he could have walked down the mountain. But he never made the journey. Something kept him in the cave with the dragons, something deeper than fear or responsibility. The physician in him recognized what was happening. He was needed here, not just for the physical healing of Tao's wound, which was now fully recovered and showing no signs of infection, but for something more important. He was needed for the healing of hearts and spirits that had been shattered by loss. Every day, Jin-Ho threw himself into his work with a fervor that surprised even himself. He used his medical knowledge to carefully examine each dragon in the pack. He looked at their teeth and their claws. He checked the color of their eyes and the condition of their scales. He asked them questions about their health, about their pain, about anything that might be causing them problems. More importantly, He listened. He sat in the cave through long evenings and listened as the dragons spoke about their past. He heard stories that made him laugh, and stories that made him cry. Teo told him about his mate, Yunji. He spoke of how she would wake up before dawn to watch the sun rise. He spoke of how she had a way of making the other dragons feel safe just by being near them. He described her colors, the way her scales had seemed to hold every shade of orange and red and gold, all at the same time. He spoke of her love for the young ones, a love so strong and so pure that she had died protecting them, staying with them even as the sickness took her from the world. As Tayo spoke about Yunji, his voice would sometimes break. Tears would run down his large face, disappearing between his scales. But he kept speaking, kept telling Jin-Ho about this dragon he had loved, kept sharing her memory even though it hurt. Jin-Ho understood that this was important, that remembering was a part of healing. Misun told stories about each of the 18 hatchlings. She knew them all by name, and she described each one with such detail that Jin-Ho could almost see them. There was Tai Sung, who had been the boldest of all the young dragons, always trying to fly higher than he was ready for. There was Min-Jun, who had been small but fierce, fighting with his brothers and sisters, even though he was smaller than all of them. There was Su-Jin, who had loved to sing, making little sounds that the older dragons said were not quite proper dragon sounds, but were beautiful anyway. She told stories about their games and their personalities and the dreams they had for their lives. Some of these stories made the dragons laugh, and some made them cry. But all of them were important because they kept the young ones alive in memory, kept them from being completely erased from the world. Daijung, the oldest dragon, spoke of the old days, before Teo was even born. He remembered when there had been many more dragons in the pack, times when the caves had been so full of sound and movement that it was hard to sleep at night. He spoke of the strength of the dragons and their ability to survive anything, to overcome any challenge. He spoke of history and tradition and the knowledge that the dragons had held for many generations. Hei-Wan, the youngest dragon, was the quietest. But as the weeks passed, she began to slowly open up. She started to follow Jin-Ho when he gathered wood for the fire or collected water from the mountain spring. She would help him, using her strong claws to drag things that were too heavy for a human to move. And slowly, as she helped with these small tasks, she began to talk. She spoke about what it was like to lose young dragons that she had watched grow. She had been only a little older than some of them, and she had helped teach them things. She felt guilty that she had not been able to save them, guilty that she was alive when they were not. These were the words of a young dragon struggling with a pain that was almost too much for her to carry. "It is not your fault," Jin-Ho told her gently, speaking the same words that someone had probably needed to say to him years ago. "You did everything you could. Sometimes sickness is stronger than we are. Sometimes we cannot win against it, no matter how hard we try." The physical work of the healing was not difficult. There were no more wounds to treat. The dragons were mostly healthy, just weak from not eating and from the weight of their grief. Jin-Ho began to bring down larger animals from the upper reaches of the mountains. The dragons hunted again, slowly at first, then with more energy as they realized that food tasted better and that their bodies needed strength to survive. But the real healing was in the talking. It was in the shared meals where they all sat together, and Jin-Ho would ask the dragons questions about themselves and their lives. It was in the nights when they would sit around the fire and share stories and memories. It was in the small moments of connection, when a dragon would place its massive head near Jin-Ho, and the human would place his small hand on the dragon's warm scale. Jin-Ho began to teach them about the world beyond their mountains. He spoke of the cities far away, where humans had built great libraries filled with books containing knowledge and stories from many generations. He spoke of healing methods that had been developed in distant lands, ways of treating sickness that the dragons had never heard of. He spoke of plant medicines that grew only in certain valleys, medicines that might have helped the hatchlings if they had been available. He taught them about humans in a way that was different from what dragons had learned from the stories of old. He spoke of humans who were kind, humans who helped each other, humans who loved deeply and suffered greatly just as dragons did. He showed them that humans were not so different from dragons, that underneath the different shapes and sizes, all creatures felt pain and love and hope and fear. And slowly, something shifted in the cave. The heaviness began to lift, just slightly. The darkness that had covered the dragons like a thick blanket began to become a little bit lighter. They still grieved for what they had lost. They would never stop grieving for the young ones, and for Yunji. But they began to understand that grief did not have to mean the complete end of life. One evening, Teo looked at Jinho and said something that surprised the human. "You have given us a gift," the great dragon said. "Not just healing for our bodies, but healing for our hearts. You have shown us that even in the darkest place there can be light. Even in the deepest pain, there can be hope." Jinho smiled, a real smile that came from deep inside him. He had come to these mountains broken by his own grief, a wandering physician with no real purpose. But in healing these dragons, in helping them find a way to continue living, he had healed something in himself as well. He had found his purpose. Spring came to the Crimson Peaks slowly, reluctantly, as though the mountains themselves were still in mourning and did not want to let go of the cold grip of winter. The snow melted bit by bit, revealing the red rock beneath it. The ice that had covered the small streams and waterfalls began to break apart, and the sound of running water echoed through the valleys for the first time in many months. The plants that had died back in the fall began to show small green shoots reaching toward the sun. Life was returning to the mountains, slowly but steadily. In the cave, Jinho noticed the change in the dragons. It was not something that happened all at once, but rather something gradual that became more obvious with each passing day. Teo stood taller. The gold color was beginning to return to his scales, replacing the dull amber that had covered them for so long. His eyes, which had been empty and hollow, were beginning to show flickers of something else. Not quite joy, but perhaps the memory of what joy felt like. Misun began to move with more purpose. She would walk through the cave and arrange things, clean the spaces where they slept. She would make small repairs to parts of the cave that had been damaged by time and weather. There was a sense that she was preparing for something, though she did not say what. Daejung's old body became stronger. The oldest dragon had spent most of the winter barely moving, barely eating enough to survive. But as the weather warmed, he began to take small walks. He would go to the entrance of the cave and look out at the mountains, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape as though he was remembering all the seasons and years he had spent in this place. Haewon changed the most of all. The young dragon had been quiet and withdrawn for so long that Jinho had begun to worry that the grief might have done permanent damage to her spirit. But with the arrival of spring, she began to smile. Not often, and not in the way she probably would have before the sickness came. But she began to smile. She began to play, running through the cave and doing small jumps that made her wings flutter. She looked like a young creature again, like someone who still had a future ahead of her. One evening, as the sun was setting and the sky was turning from blue to orange to purple, Haewon said something that caught everyone's attention. "We could fly," she said, her voice tentative, as though she was afraid that speaking the words out loud might break something precious and fragile. "We haven't flown since—" Her voice trailed off, but everyone knew what she meant. They had not flown since the hatchlings were taken by the sickness. The cave became very quiet. The suggestion of flying felt like a suggestion to move forward, to step away from the grief that had held them prisoner for so long. It felt dangerous and brave at the same time. Teo was the first to respond. "I have not wanted to feel the wind beneath my wings," he said slowly. "I have not wanted to feel the freedom that flying brings, knowing that those we loved will never fly again." "But they are gone," Dae-jung said quietly. His old voice was steady and thoughtful. "Nothing we do or do not do will change that, and they would not want us to stop living. They would want us to fly, to survive, to be strong. It is a beginning," he said. And there was a finality in his voice that suggested he had thought about this for a very long time. Mi-sun nodded slowly. "It is a beginning," she agreed. Teo looked at each dragon in turn, then looked at Jin-ho. The human was sitting on a stone near the fire, watching them with understanding in his eyes. Jin-ho knew what it meant to survive grief, to find a way to continue living when everything inside you wanted to stop. His quiet presence gave the dragons courage. "Then we will fly," Teo said finally. "At dawn, we will fly." The dragons slept little that night. They were too excited, too nervous, too full of the feeling of something important about to happen. Jin-ho sat with them, and they did not ask him to leave. He stayed until near dawn, then walked to the cave entrance to watch. The sun rose over the crimson peaks, painting the red rocks gold and orange. The light was beautiful and gentle and full of promise. The four dragons walked to the entrance of the cave and stood looking out at the world beyond. Teo took a deep breath. His great wings stretched out, spreading wider than a human was tall. The scales on his wings caught the light and threw it back in 1,000 shades of gold and amber. He ran forward, his powerful legs pushing him toward the edge of the cliff. For a moment, he seemed to fall. Then, with a mighty sweep of his wings, he caught the air and rose upward. The other 3 dragons followed. Mi-sun rose into the sky with the grace of a dancer. Dae-jung, moving more slowly, spread his ancient wings and lifted into the air with a determination that showed he had not forgotten how to fly. Haiwan laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed to ring out across the entire mountain range, and she spiraled upward with a young dragon's energy and happiness. Jin-ho watched from the cliff's edge, his hand shading his eyes against the brightness of the sun. The 4 dragons climbed higher and higher, their wings catching the wind and the sunlight. They looked beautiful, magnificent, powerful, and alive. They looked like creatures who remembered what it meant to be dragons, to be free, to fly through an endless sky. They circled the peaks 3 times. With each circle, their movements became more confident, more joyful. The grief was still there, buried deep inside their hearts where it would always remain. But it was no longer the only thing they felt. They felt wind beneath their wings. They felt the strength of their bodies. They felt the brightness of the sun. When they returned, landing on the cliff with powerful thrusts of their wings, something had changed. They had not left their grief behind, but they had proven to themselves that they could still live, that they could still experience joy and freedom and beauty. Teo was the first to approach Jin-ho after they landed. The great dragon lowered his massive head so that it was level with the human's face. "Thank you," he said, his voice strong and clear. "Not just for healing our bodies, but for reminding us how to live. You have given us back something we thought was lost forever." Jin-ho reached out and placed his hand on the dragon's warm scale. There were tears in his eyes, but they were not sad tears. They were tears of hope, of the knowledge that healing was possible, that even the deepest grief could eventually transform into strength.